Imagine with me for just a minute that it's Christmas time and the family is gathered around the family dinner table for the Christmas Eve dinner. And there's lots of sharing and talking and joking, but all of a sudden, for some reason, somebody brings up the issue of climate change or immigration. And somebody else picks up on that, and somebody else picks up on it, and the next thing you know, things are going out of control. Emotions quickly gain momentum, and sooner or later somebody feels attacked, because these emotions about what's going on in our culture today are so deeply embedded inside of us. And that person who feels attacked, they get up and they leave the family table on Christmas Eve. And there's a silence and everyone feels so awkward. We don't want to hurt each other, do we? We want to agree on things. We want to be together as families. But beneath the surface, lurking deep beneath the surface, are these currents of division from the West Coast to the East Coast, from generation to generation. And there are highly charged emotions, and it's like a tinderbox ready to set fire and explode right around the family table. We live in a time of unique moral and ethical differences. We see things so differently, don't we? So I want to provide a context of why some of that might be happening. And I hope it gives you some insights in why we're so divided. And I want to talk about ideology and thoughts and feelings and emotions. I have recently begun to think that we're very similar in our time period to the period of the judges in the Old Testament, 12 to 1000 BCE. Israel's not a nation yet. They're a loose federation of tribes. But when crisis would come, they would come together and God would give them leaders, Deborah or Gideon or Samson, to lead them through their troubles. But there's a refrain that's repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. The first time we see it is in Judges chapter 2, verse 11, where we read, "And Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." This is a constant refrain we see repeated over and over and over again. The people do evil. God brings judgment upon them. He delivers them into the hands of foreign nations. They suffer greatly. They cry out to God for help. God redeems them and delivers them by raising up judges to lead them out of their suffering and their captivity. And this pattern is repeated over and over again. Then they do evil again, and they suffer and are delivered into the hands of the foreign nations, and then God brings a judge and delivers them, and they do evil again. Now, here's the point in reminding us of that passage. It's not just that the people did evil. If you read the passage closely, you see that it's a question of who determines the evil. The evil was done in the sight of God. Who determines what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wicked? God does. Evil was determined by God. In the judge's view, there was an absolute God who had absolute truth that stands over and above the people, over and above you and me, us. And that truth, that absolute truth, is good for all people at all times and in all places. The question being asked here is this: do the people determine what is right and wrong and good and bad? Or does God have an opinion? And if God has an opinion, is his opinion relative or is it absolute? Is God's opinion relative? That is it simply an opinion, or is God's opinion absolute? Well, the judges deemed God's opinion as absolute. They see certain patterns of behavior are deemed as evil by God because God deemed them as evil. They see that there's this external truth source that stands over and above them from an infinite vantage point and an unlimited perspective, which brings truth into their world. The book of Judges ends this way in describing the cultural milieu of the federation of tribes, and I think it's very similar to our culture today. Judges chapter 1, verse 25 reads, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Right in his own eyes. They did whatever they wanted to do. The people say, there is no absolute God and there is no absolute truth. Everything is relative, which is shorthand for I get to make the rules around here. To which God replies, One, there is an absolute God. Two, there is absolute truth. And three, there is a transcendent, absolute standard that defines good and bad, right or wrong. Now, if there is an absolute God and there is absolute truth and there are absolute standards of ethical conduct in our lives, the transcendent standards that define good and bad and right or wrong, uh, if there is a God with those kinds of absolute standards, he's not just given those to believers in him, but the Bible teaches that God has given those standards to all people at all times, in all circumstances, all nations, all cultures. He's given a standard of ethical laws to live by that govern all human conduct. Everyone God creates is answerable to his standards. This is the basis of all human ethics. And if we look at all the peoples who have lived in all the different cultures and all the different generations and all the different societies, we will find there are certain codes of moral conduct that all people prescribe to. It's wrong to steal. It is wrong to kill people. Everybody would agree to those things. Now, certainly there are anomalies in history, but most people will say, yeah, we can't have society or culture if we don't govern ourselves in this manner. In the book of Amos, God judges the foreign nations, and they come to Amos and they say, how can your God be judging us? We don't believe in your God. We don't believe in his standards for living. And Amos says, it's not a question of whether you believe or not. Here, there is an absolute God, there's absolute truth, and there are ultimate standards of living by which we must govern ourselves. And they're good for all people at all times and in all places. Paul writes in Romans chapter 2, verse 15, these words, they, that is the people of the world, show that their works of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. There's a conflict between good and evil inside of us, even though there are moral standards. He's saying that the works of the law, the standards of God, the absolute standards of God, are written on all people's hearts, while their conscience also bears witness to those standards that God has written. They're inside of us. They're indelible. Everybody knows that it's wrong to steal, and it's wrong to lie, and it's wrong to kill. All people are related to God by his laws. We might deny them, but we cannot destroy them or erase them. Because when we do, we get sideways, and we can't always get back together again. Our great divide is a divide over the question of absolute being, of absolute truth, and of absolute standards for living that guide all people at all times and in all places. Now, this issue of absolutes is absolutely critical to our culture. In a study or survey by the Cultural Research Center under the leadership of George Barna in 2020, they were asking the question, where do Americans look for a truth source in life? And they found that less than 50% of our population believe in an absolute God, in absolute truth, and absolute standards for living. Moreover, those that are under 30, only 31% believed in an absolute God or absolute truth sources or an absolute standard for living. This is a seismic shift in our culture. We're moving toward an untethered society that is completely adrift. As you know, for those under 18 years old, the prevailing theology of the day is what they call moral, therapeutic deism. It's moral. The ultimate goal of life is to be good and to be tolerant of all people. It is therapeutic. The ultimate goal of my life is to be happy. And it is deistic, that if I get in trouble, there's this general notion of the belief in God who exists out there somewhere. I don't know who he is or what she is or what it's like, but I do believe in some kind of spiritual entity. Moral, therapeutic deism. That kind of belief system has staggering implications for the future of our culture. We may debate immigration or abortion or climate change or racial relations, but our deepest divide is over the issue of an outside truth source, an absolute God, absolute standards for living, good for all people at all times and in all places. And I would contend that until we get that issue settled, we really can't settle any of these other issues because we have no common source to appeal to. There is no common truth source. It's only what I think or what you think. And oftentimes today, it's if I think it, then it must be true. And if it's true for me, then it must be true for you. And if you don't agree with what's true for me is true for you, then I get angry at you and we get divided. The Bible teaches that one of the reasons that we don't believe in an absolute God or an absolute truth source or absolute standards for living is a subjective one by nature. That we want to feel good about what we do. We don't want any restraints upon us. We want to be free to do whatever we want to do. We don't want to be governed by an outward source. We want to make the rules. You know, a kid, a little baby, when they first begin to talk, they learn the words me and mine and no way and right now and I'm in charge around here, nobody else. And I think that instinct carries on through to adulthood. I don't need to submit myself to a God who wants to govern my life with certain cultural ethics. No, I want to be the God of the universe. And I think there's another reason that we tend to not want to believe or shy away from absolutes, whether it be in God or truth or in standards for living. It's because we tend as human beings to follow public opinion polls, and then we tend to treat them as truth. We go along what most people believe. When we raise our children, I can remember my oldest son going to sleepovers, and of course we would call the parents and make sure everything was supervised and okay. And I remember one Friday he came home and said, "Hey, I'm going to go to a sleepover at Johnny's house tonight," and I said, "Well, let me call his parents and make sure everything's okay." And he said, "No, you don't need to do that. Johnny's parents are away on vacation." And I said, "You mean you want to go and sleep over with no supervision and no parents around?" "Yeah." "Well, I don't think that's going to happen." "But Dad, all of the other kids are doing it. And if everybody else is doing it, it must be okay. It must be right." He's appealing to a pattern of behavior that is accepted at a particular moment in time by a particular group as a truth source. When Nietzsche in the late 1800s described the decadence of the German culture, he called it a herd mentality, that one of the chief indicators of the decay of a culture are people who get the idea of what is right or wrong from what everyone else is doing. And the problem with that is that it doesn't mean that it's true, but truth changes depending upon how people change and people's perception of the truth changes. For instance, in the 1960s, we had the sexual revolution, a movement away from traditional moral sexual values. And they gave way to a new morality, which at that time stood out. It was a different tradition from what most people had been used to. Today, the sexual revolution of the 60s is normative in our lives. It's the standard. As a pastor, when I do weddings, I can tell you that in the 60s, very few couples would admit that they were living together if they were living together. But in this day and age, most of the couples who come for marriage are already living together. It is the accepted cultural norm. One of the mentors that I've had in my life is a man by the name of R.C. Sproul. He is the founder of the Ligonier Ministries, and he taught me categories or patterns and concepts and terminology to define and understand culture. And I've used them throughout my life. I want to share them with you now. That has to do with this understanding of herd mentality and ethics and morality. Now, one of the reasons for this herd mentality of popular opinion is a lack of understanding between the concepts of ethics and morality. In our culture, we tend to use the two terms interchangeably, but traditionally, historically, academically, there is a sharp distinction between the two. Now, let me just take a moment to define the difference between morality and ethics to you. Morality comes from the word mores. It's an anthropological term. It is the study of the customs and the manners and the social behaviors of a culture. For instance, there are different behaviors in India than there are in Africa or in Europe or the United States. There are different patterns or customs within each culture. Several years ago, I did a wedding for a young couple. They were Christians, but their families were from a different country, and they had significantly different customs about marriage. So I did the Episcopal or Anglican wedding service, but in the midst of that were the traditions of their family, in which the young couple ate a meal in front of their first meal in front of the congregation in a tent. And in the midst of that meal, there were all of these customs of food and symbolic actions. That is what we call morality. It is the cultural, social behaviors of certain people. That is why morality is the study of the day-to-day behavior of people. It is a descriptive science. It doesn't say what ought to be. It describes how things are, what is taking place, what are the habits, what is the custom, what are the behaviors. Those are the morals. They are descriptive by nature. They describe how a people live. It has to do with what we call isness. Isness. What is happening at a particular moment in time? How do we do things in our culture as our customs have been brought to us by our predecessors? That's why mores are in the indicative mood, morality. They tell us what happened. The door is shut. The car is running. The house is locked. Now, conversely, ethics comes from the word ethos. It has to do with the normative sciences. It deals with norms, with standards, with laws that govern society. It is the foundation on which civilizations are structured. It has to do with oughtness, with what ought to be. Ethics is the study of how things ought to be done or to be lived. It is in the imperative mood, the language of command. It is an obligation. Not the door is shut, but shut the door. Not the car is running, but start the car. Not the house is locked, but lock the house. This oughtness, these ethics are designed to govern behavior for all people. They are communicated by this command, the imperative voice, as the means by which all people are to submit their behaviors for the sake of the common good. So mores are descriptive. They deal with the world of isness, of what is, in the indicative mood, describing how things are and how they have been done. Ethics is normative, it's ethos, it is the oughtness of life. Those are standards by which all people are to govern themselves in the imperative mood of a command. Now we see this sharp distinction has been blurred by our culture these days. The words are used interchangeably between custom and between oughtness, between what is and what ought to be. And this causes a lot of confusion and leads us into that statistical morality or herd morality that Nietzsche talked about. We do studies to see how people are behaving. If they favor marijuana or they favor abortion in their behavioral patterns, then those patterns are then considered to be popular. They become normative. They become an ethic. We take a vote, we pass a law, and behavior then becomes a standard by which we ought to govern. And this leads us to secular humanism and to moral relativism. Now, let me make a final distinction here. We live in the age of secular humanism, which says that we are capable on our own of determining our own ethical morals, our own ethical laws, our own ethical views, our own ethical standards. We do not need a God to determine that for us, which leads to moral relativism, which says that there is no absolute truth. There is no absolute right or wrong. All truth is relative. Now, we know the logical fallacy of that line of thinking. The person that says there is no absolute truth has just made what kind of statement? An absolute statement. It is absolutely true that there is no absolute truth. The statement there are no rights or wrongs is a statement that's wrong to say there is a right or a wrong. So we know that we've just got to put the cards out on the table and say, well, what really then is truth? Since everything is absolute, including a statement that says there are no absolutes. And what we find is that when we deny absolutes, we tend to do so subjectively. What's behind the denial is the emergence of relativism in our culture. It's the idea that absolute truth gets into conflict with how we choose to live our lives. Moral relativism is our attempt to justify our behavior and give us a license to escape from any kind of absolute standard, ethic, or norm in our lives. Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, no absolute, then all things are permissible. He is saying that if there is no absolute being who decrees absolute truth, there is no ultimate foundation for any truth. All things then are permissible. I determine what are the laws. Truth then is determined by human convention from a limited, finite vantage point, rather than truth being determined from an eternal perspective and an infinite vantage point. And the problem with that kind of thinking is if there is no ultimate being, then there are no ultimate ethics. I'd rather something over and above me that's infinite and eternal determine what is truth than for me in my finite little world to try to figure out what's right and what's wrong. You see, what happens when we don't have an absolute God and when we don't have absolute truth and we don't have absolute standards to govern our living, we are left with secular humanism and moral relativism. So here's what I'm thinking. There is an absolute God who gives us absolute truth, who provides absolute standards for living, for our lives and good for all people at all times and in all places. And when we deny those truths, we live in the day of the judges, and everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Whatever we want to do, there are no absolutes. Everything is relative. There are no directions or standards or ethics or norms for us to govern our lives. And you can see that that leaves us in an incredible debate and a conflict within us. And until we can come to some agreement on an absolute God who has given us an absolute truth source and has given us absolute standards for living, not in a legalistic way, filled with grace and love and mercy. But until we can agree to that, then we have no basis to appeal. And we are going to have a tough time around the family dinner table.